Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to BookTube at War. This is a new BookTube event for 2023. It was thought up by a viewer, DDB, and made into a BookTube event by Michael K. Vaughan, and it concentrates, as you can tell from its title, on military literature. Military memoirs, history, science fiction, fantasy, fiction, and I've been doing a lot of this reading. I'm well ahead of the event now because I missed a few days in July. But I typically add, for any BookTube event, a book to my night's reading. And that's going to get harder and harder to do for BookTube at War because there are some pieces of military literature that I want to read that are quite long. There's no way that I could do them added to my night's reading. And much as I love BookTube, there's no way that I can let BookTube start to dictate the whole of my reading. I have lots of other things to read as well, lots and lots of other things to read, and that's just going to get worse as the autumn comes and the book publishing world here in the United States starts to gear up and throw more you-know-what at the wall. But so far, I can still devote a large chunk of my reading to whatever BookTube event I'm involved in. Right now, it's Book Trek and BookTube at War. And in August, well, in August, it will be Garb August. And last night I read a longer work. Not as long as some of the ones I have my eyes on. But still, it took me, a good chunk of hours to read through it, especially since I did it pencil in hand to really get it. I've read it a couple of times before, but I'm not sure that I'll ever read it again. BookTube at War seemed like the opportunity. The book that I chose for last night was this, Passing of the Armies, by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who was a Union commander who's most famous probably for the great dramatic thing that he did at the Battle of Gettysburg. He did a dramatic move in a make or break moment at the Battle of Gettysburg, and military historians have loved to talk about it ever since. And then it got its moment in the sun in Ken Burns' documentary, The Civil War, which, if you have not seen, you absolutely should see. When it comes to a BookTube at War viewing list, as opposed to a reading list, Ken Burns' The Civil War is right up there with the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers. You really have to see these things. Maybe a starter kit or a top 10 list is in order for that sort of thing. I think there was a movie made as well of that unlikely maneuver that he does. Really a make or break thing where if it didn't work, if you had misjudged the ground, if you didn't get everything going your way, you'd have been leading your men charging downhill into disaster. They would have been wiped out. Commanders are sometimes forced into corners like that. Usually it doesn't go well for them. In the case of Chamberlain, it did. And he was a Yankee. He was an extreme Yankee and also a bookworm. So he makes for a fascinating figure anyway. And he wrote this book. He wrote it carefully and lovingly, and it was published after his death. He never actually saw it as a book. It was published in 1915, which gives you a really good way of viscerally seeing how alive the American Civil War was for the generation that went to World War I. It was pretty alive. This book came out only a couple of years before the world was convulsed in a war that very much took the lessons of the American Civil War and brought them to the next level. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, famously of the Battle of Gettysburg, almost lived long enough to see that. Did live long enough to know, probably to know, that the world was descending into war again, a much bigger war than what he had been through. And this tells the story of his, I guess you could say, adventures in the American Civil War. Of course, the centerpiece of the book will be Gettysburg, but there's lots of other things too. He gives you long pen portraits here of all the people that he knew, especially the famous people, especially oddly, Phil Sheridan was a diminutive Union general who has a very interesting life, a very interesting military career, really needs a 1,000-page biography. That would be really great. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain himself has been well served by historians, in my opinion. I know that it feels like heresy once you know about his career at Gettysburg, but he is a minor figure in the war. every war has a general or a commander that does something like that in the heat of the moment. Every war has people like that. You can find details like that in every war. I don't know that that requires that we put the person up on a pedestal. I think he's been well served by historians, biographers. There's an anthology of his letters. This is a very good book. It suffers from the fault that a lot of Civil War memoirs have, which is that the author is trying to write as though it has been translated from Latin. They're trying to write as if it's Caesar's dispatches, the Caesar's Gallic War dispatches. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was trained in Latin. He was trained in those dispatches. A lot of these guys were, and dreamt of writing this big granite monument of a military book that would be taught at West Point for 1,000 years. That tone is employed by writers who really ought to know better and who never wrote that way when they weren't writing for the slopes of Mount Helicon. And it was also imitated by writers who certainly knew better, like, for instance, the author of the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, which very much goes for the same thing. It very much goes for the same marble bust on a shelf type reading experience. This thing does, and I'm calling that a fault because it's a complete bar to readability, almost a complete bar to readability, unless you are familiar with those Latin military classics. Unless you're one of the very rare, small fraction of readership that actually likes those cadences, you're probably going to find this kind of stodgy writing. It's pretty much the definition of stodgy writing, and it's the reason why so much 19th century writing is stodgy in the exact same way, because all of these authors were translating their English out of Latin in their heads. So you get a great insider view here. The portraits of Sheridan here, I think, would be indispensable for a new biography of Phil Sheridan, for instance, who was an entirely unsavory character. I'm not saying that he's a hero who needs a new biography. He was a vicious, homicidal racist, but nevertheless, he was a pivotal figure in a couple of different military campaigns on behalf of the United States in the 19th century. Sort of deserves more attention than he's had. Who knows? Maybe someday there'll be a new wave of interest in the American Civil War, maybe a new wave of biographies. Of course, 2061 will be the anniversary. It will be the anniversary of the start of the American Civil War. But in 2061, there will probably be a renaissance of histories about the war. But in 2061, they will all be praising the Confederates, and not for states' rights. That is an issue that's active in this book. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, like most Union generals at the close of the war, has nothing but praise for his Confederate opponents. He considers them honorable enemies, even though they were enslaving other people. He considers them honorable enemies and valiant foes. All throughout this book. I read this, I don't even know, 50 years ago. I read a hardcover out of a library. And I read it again when Ken Burns' documentary came out. I couldn't get enough, like everybody else in the country, I couldn't get enough of reading Civil War stuff when I was being amazed by that documentary in every episode. It never occurred to me back then. The thought never crossed my mind that America would change the way that it has. I didn't know that was. I didn't imagine that was going to happen. I didn't imagine that one of the two major political parties in the United States would openly muse over the possibility that maybe the Confederate States were right, that maybe the Confederacy was the right side of the war, not the wrong side, and on the question of slavery. That maybe this whole thing wasn't all that bad, and maybe slaves didn't have it all that bad. Maybe it wasn't all that bad a thing to have. Once we completely disenfranchise women, we really ought to get around to everybody else. I am 100% convinced there was just a rabid fascist Bund meeting here in the United States, Turning Points USA. Trump was there and gave a speech that I don't advocate that you listen to it, but you really have to hear it to believe it. And I am 100% convinced, 100% convinced. I don't know that this didn't happen. I didn't listen to every inch of Turning Point USA, but I'm 100% convinced that if a Republican figure of some kind or other got up on a stage at Turning Point and talked about the good old days of slavery, I am 100% convinced they would get a standing ovation. So, reading a book like I did last night, where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is extolling the virtues, raising up the valor of the generals who were fighting for slavery, was a little bit weird. It was a change in the reading experience, the rereading experience of this book, of a type that I never would have thought possible. I would have always, with rereading, I think that my reading of the book will change because I will learn more about the things that are in it as time goes on. And that will inform any rereading. When I read this, 40 years ago, I thought, well, there'll be a couple of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain books that will come out. There'll be a couple of histories of the Army of the Potomac. There'll be a couple of books about Phil Sheridan. And I'll read all of those books because there'll be new releases. And then my thought was, I will, of course, be reading those things. And then when the time comes and I want to reread The Passing of the Armies, I will come to it with all of that stuff. I will change my reading experience. And my reading experience was very much changed last night, but not in the ways that I would ever have expected. Although, one thing, I don't mean to sound ambiguous about this, it is a lovely reading experience. It's stodgy, but when, as is true with all of those 19th century writers who were translating their works out of the Latin in their head, once you get used to that diction, it can be quite lovely. I want to read you just one passage here that Chamberlain writes about the two sides, about the opposing sides. There is our hero in his glory days. A consideration which had great influence on the habits of thought which go to confirm character was the cause in which each side was engaged. On both sides we had been fighting for what we respectively held to be the nature of our political life as a people. On the Confederate side, they were fighting for existing institutions, having historic warrant and, as they claimed, constitutional warrant as well. As the war had to be carried on in the territory whence the challenge came, there was opportunity to make the gist of their cause very clear and expressible in quite concrete terms. Believe it or not, despite the Churchillian circumlocution there, I believe that Chamberlain is talking about slavery here. They could say, for instance, that they were fighting for their homes. On our side, the same general principles were affirmed, but their application was not limited to the existing status or institutions. There's that word again. Gathered rather to guiding and germinant ideas. The expressed intent and purpose of our fathers in establishing the government of one great people and the inborn right of every human being to make the best of himself and the duty of all to help him do this. That is indeed a high ideal. I do believe he is still talking about slavery. It was night around us, but overhead were the stars. Every once in a while, in Chamberlain's book, it happens regularly, that will happen. You'll be in the middle of this extremely Latinate prose, germinant. Do you ever use that word? No, you don't ever use that word. So, germinant. Every once in a while, you will be in the midst of extremely Latinate prose, and then you will get a wonderfully American line of English. It was night around us, but overhead were the stars. Wonderful. Things were in a chaos of transition, but the forward look was clear. If in these later days they have not yet been fully realized, these principles have been clearly reaffirmed, and our consecration has been made more binding by the priceless cost of the vindication. That is a reference to something that we saw in the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club in This Republic of Suffering, where both sides started to put a lot of psychic freight on the fact that whatever was decided by this war, it was decided in rivers of blood. It was consecrated in rivers of blood. You see that word everywhere in the generation after the war ended. Very powerful stuff. And I have to say also the extremely Latinate, Tacitian verbiage, the style there of the writing, also goes away usually when Chamberlain is writing about individual people. None of his frequent digressions about Phil Sheridan, for instance, read anything like Germinate. They read much more like Letters to Home. So I'm glad that I read this again. Really, really strange to read a book like this when the news commentariat on all sides of the political spectrum routinely now talks about an impending civil war in the United States. It's really weird to read a book about an actual civil war when that kind of verbiage is all over the news and social media. But it did make me want to go back to there's a great letter collection of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain that I have over on the shelf there, and maybe this made me tempted to go back to that, but I don't think I will. First of all, it's not exclusively military. I'm certainly not going to go back to it for BookTube at War. BookTube at War, I don't know. I think the thing that I want to do for BookTube at War is not conducive to daily videos, which is to reread a couple of longer works. This thing is pretty long to add to the night's reading and still get any other night's reading done. But I don't want to let the side down. So maybe turn to fiction again and reread those longer works on my own. I don't know. I'll figure it out. I have all day to figure out what the night's reading is going to be. Who knows? Everything changes. The levers, the currents, they shift all around all day. And then once I see that my little bean is starting to get not just sleepy, she gets sleepy periodically throughout the day now, but overnight sleepy, time to go to bed sleepy. Once I see that, that's my cue to start assembling my definitive night's reading. What am I going to do while she's asleep? And who knows? It's many, many hours between now and then. So who knows what it will be. I will report back for a field report tomorrow and let you know. Thank you, BookTube.